This is Seymour Rocks reporting from down under. As usual, I've got problems with software and stuff, and my partner's getting a warning on her computer that something's wrong with the network. There's something that might, yeah. Anyway, this came across my bow today. Climate change, how China moved from leader to laggard. Alarm ahead of UN meeting. So that's not what I've been getting in the propaganda uh, over the years. So the smoggy city of Beijing is known for two things: donkey burgers and solar panels. An industrial centre just south of Beijing, 45 minutes via high-speed rail valley because it is for solar, said Mr. Yu. China, running at 53 gigawatts in 2017 when demand peaked, will be around 40% lower this year, he estimates. The photographs in his office show Yingli in its glory days a decade ago. Sales were surging, and the company spent millions sponsoring the 2010 and 2014 football World Cup tournaments. Yingli was the world's largest solar panel maker in 2012 and 2013, exporting all over the globe and celebrated in China as a national champion. Its huge factory campus in Beijing still nods to that status, with a spacious museum dedicated to the company's history as a solar pioneer. Today, Yingli has been defaulting on debt payments since 2016. In 2018, it was kicked off the New York Stock Exchange because its market capitalization had sunk below the minimum $50 million threshold. Although Yingli still makes solar panels, its factories operate at a loss, and the most valuable asset it has is the land beneath them. Some question how Yingli is still operating, but analysts believe the political connections of its founders may have helped stave off creditors. The company is the highest profile casualty of a change in policy that is being felt across the renewable energy sector in a country once celebrated as the world's cleanest energy champion. Chinese investment in clean energy is plummeting, down from $76 billion during the first half of 2017 to $29 billion during the first half of this year. For the annual UN climate talks starting next Monday, that is alarming. Concerns over the impact of climate change have never been higher, but the gap between what countries should be doing and what they're actually doing, pumping rising levels of carbon dioxide into the air, has never been greater. With the US withdrawing from the US Paris Accord, an increasing amount of attention is on China. The country is both the greenest in the world but also the most polluting. It has more wind and solar power than anybody else, and yet it is also the world's biggest builder of new coal plants. Last year, its emissions hit a record high, accounting for more than half of the global increase in energy-related CO2 emissions in 2018, according to the International Energy Agency. This year, Chinese emissions are expected to grow about 3% from 2018. Everything is at stake for the planet because the Chinese economy is so much bigger than any other, said Adair Turner, chair of Energy Transitions Commission. Even the whole of Europe is considerably less than the Chinese emissions. He points to China's current pledge that its CO2 emissions will peak by 2030 and says that is nowhere near ambitious enough. Let's be clear, if that was all China ever did, then we are on the path to climate disaster, says Lord Turner, who is lobbying for China to consider a target of net zero emissions by 2050. That is true of all the countries that have made pledges under the Paris Accord. Everyone has always known there would have to be very significant improvements to get us anywhere near close to 2C. The Paris Climate Accord, of which China is a signatory, pledges to limit global warming to well below 2C, but that goal looks increasingly out of touch. The world is on track for 3C of global warming by the end of the century if current trends continue. That would mean higher sea levels of as much as 1 metre, threatening more than 600 million people in low-lying and coastal areas. Well, yada-da-dee-da. China's investment in renewable energy fell 39% in the first half of this year compared with the same period in 2018, according to data from the Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Beijing yanked subsidies for solar panel projects in the middle of the year and is shrinking those for wind, causing an abrupt shift. Well, their economy, like everywhere else, is imploding. This is probably a low point, says Li Junfeng, a senior renewable energy policymaker and head of the National Centre for Climate Change Strategy Research, part of the Government Planning Ministry. The new policy is not in place yet, and the old policy of subsidies has been stopped. 5 years ago, when the economy was growing robustly, Beijing saw stronger environmental policies as core to its economic transformation away from energy-intensive heavy industry. Today, with the economy growing at its slowest pace since the 1990s, that has changed. The highest political priority in China is trying to stabilize the economy. You can put a line under that, says Kevin Tu, an energy economist who previously led the China desk at the IEA. Anything else, including environmental protection, especially climate change, will have to make some room for these political priorities. On paper, China's climate targets have not changed. Beijing has pledged that its carbon dioxide emissions will peak by 2030 and it will draw 20% of its primary energy from non-fossil sources by that same date. Yet that promise would allow China to keep increasing its emissions for the next decade, with devastating implications for the planet. Its investments in the Belt and Road Initiative, under which state banks have earmarked more than $30 billion to build coal-fired power plants in other countries, is also adding to global emissions. So I didn't really know that. China's participation in the Paris Climate Pact in 2015 was heralded as a great victory by climate activists, convincing Beijing to set climate targets was a top priority for the Obama administration, but baked into the negotiations was an expectation that China would achieve its emission target much earlier than 2030. Next year will be crucial as countries that signed the Paris Accord are supposed to submit enhanced targets, but the mood in Beijing makes a tougher climate goal less likely for China. Mr. Lee says deteriorating relations between the US and China, along with unrest in Hong Kong, have helped fuel a growing nationalist sentiment and a broader anger at the West. One of the targets of this nationalist ire has been Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenage activist who is revered as a climate hero in some parts of the world. Many netizens see Greta as representing the general liberal Western agenda, says Mr. Lee, and there is this larger perspective that the West is ganging up against China. At the same time, coal appears to be again in the ascendant, with Li Keqiang, China's premier, last month identifying it as a priority area. China remains the biggest producer. Many see this as part of a growing focus on energy security in Beijing, a result of Chinese leaders being spooked by deteriorating West relations with the West. Energy security anxiety is a blessing for the coal sector in China, says Mr. Tu. Policymakers are also focused on keeping the cost of power cheap to help stimulate the economy. So from January, the price of electricity from coal-fired power plants, which is centrally regulated, will be allowed to fluctuate and is expected to fall. These factors have compounded the pain for the renewable energy industry. After benefiting from generous subsidies for more than a decade, Beijing axed solar subsidies without warning last year. The payments due have created a deficit of around $28 billion in the Renewable Energy Development Fund that was paying out the subsidies. Frank Halgwitz, founder of Asia Europe Clean Energy Solar Advisory in Hong Kong, says the subsidies contributed to a solar surge that exceeded the government's expectations, triggering the sudden cut. The dice are now loaded in coal's favour. The new policies for renewable energy are focused on grid parity, only building wind and solar projects that can compete with the price of coal. Yet with coal prices dropping and a glut of new coal-fired power stations coming online, it may be challenging for wind and solar to compete. In the wind industry, there has been a rush of projects this year as developers try to capture the last of the subsidies. The diplomatic pressure on China to improve its climate targets has been played out in public. During a state visit from Emmanuel Macron, the French president, earlier this month, both sides issued a joint declaration vowing that the Paris climate deal was irreversible and promising new climate targets aimed at the middle of the century. Chinese policymakers such as Li Junfeng say the pressure is misplaced, as China is likely to exceed existing climate targets, even if it does not officially adopt new ones. Now that the US has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, the entire global response to climate change is shifting. He says we have to be realistic. There's no point in being in a rush. He also points out that China has achieved and so far surpassed most of its previous climate targets. A pledge to cut carbon intensity, the amount of carbon produced per unit of GDP, by between 40 to 50% by 2020 compared with 2005 levels, was achieved 3 years early. It also overachieved on its targets for solar installations, although this runaway growth led to the subsidy deficit. For many years, action on climate change was the one area that Beijing and Western capitals could usually agree on. Even the most hawkish Western politician would hold up China's climate record as an example to be praised, even though I've showed it to be a lie countless times. But that may be changing. It's going to sour for sure if China doesn't move in the right direction quickly enough, said Tom Stern, the chief US negotiator for the Paris Agreement, who adds that there is simply less leeway now in terms of global emissions. We can't possibly do what we need to do unless China is doing a bit. We are now entering a new world now. It is not just a sense of urgency, it is the math. Do the math and you'll see whether we are doing enough, says Mr. Stern. The Paris Agreement is going to rise and fall on the level of political will in the constituent countries. That's always been true. The fault is that there's a lack of political will in every country compared to what there needs to be. Although every country on this earth is motivated by exactly the same motivations as China. Yeah, I won't read that out. So there we are. That's pretty stark, isn't it? A truth bomb, I would call it.